When I was in second grade, my uncle had recently died and I woke up from a nightmare yelling. Basically, what happened in the nightmare is I went to talk to my dad, but the man wasn't my father and was some Asian dude with pale skin and black veins. I scream and run to my room. I try and hide, but this figure finds me and does a Darth Vader force choke hold, saying something like you can run but you can't hide. After I wake up, I see my sister, call her over because she's awake now, and I'm terrified because I see something in the corner of the room. She lays down with me. It felt like hours passed while hiding under a blanket. Eventually, I felt safe enough to fall asleep, so I did. I should mention that a short time after my uncle died, but before the dream, I felt like something was in my room watching me. I don't remember many encounters after that until late third grade. So I'm on my dirt bike, speeding through this intersection area. I wasn't paying much attention until I thought I saw my brother racing towards me, causing me to swerve and almost hit a tree. I looked back and no one was there. Sure, go ahead and say it was my imagination, but that happened twice. Through the years, I just found this entity as a comforting presence. I tried to overlook the weird nightmare where I met him and the dirt bike incident. He was pretty quiet except for the occasional "huh, that's weird. Ooh, it must be a ghost." But then the end of 7th grade happened. Had made a small group of friends and invited them over for a sleepover. I too skip over the details of my mom hating all of the girls because they were weird, which I understand her view, but, really, Mom? Geez, you don't have to be so mean. At some point during the evening, maybe 5 or 6 p.m., we go outside. I get hit with this extreme anger and start screaming at my sister. I yell at her sometimes, but never like this. Eventually, we go out to the field behind my house where we ride the dirt bikes, and the girls start saying they see a black figure out there, but I don't see anything. I think it's just a deer, but no, everyone is freaking out and just want to knock them out to shut them up. Then girl number 1 starts to let my dog out of the yard like it's a game, and I have to scream at her to stop because he can't be out there. After wrangling my dog and bringing him inside again and again, girl number 1 stops and she starts getting paranoid again. I decided to sit in the field to prove my point that nothing is out there besides some deer. Eventually, everyone is crying and yelling for me to come back, and I'm just pissed, but I'm tired of them all, so I'm in a numb state. But I go back to my house because I was annoyed by their yelling. As it gets later, we're all hanging out and no hard feelings from what I can tell. It gets late and I'm super drained and fall asleep. The next morning I woke up with a bruise on my arm that was shaped by an infinity symbol, and the girls have weird marks and scratches on them. I have 2 or 3 scratches on my wrist, but aside from that we're all fine, although I'm extremely tired. There isn't much else that happens aside from us using a ghost app and screaming our heads off while running away from some trees because the ghost app goes to red and it's creepy as fuck. Now we're getting to today. My door is opening and closing by itself, and has been doing this for about 2 weeks. I've also heard the occasional slam from my basement door, which has freaked me out, so something in my house has a love for doors. It's driving me insane, and I've had to shut my door completely because of it, since I used to keep the door an inch from shutting to try and keep it quiet when I open it at night, and it just turned into a habit. So the door only opens and closes from 1 p.m. to 6 to 7 p.m. and only opens about 2 inches. So in conclusion, my friend thinks the entity feeds off the negative energy in my house, which could definitely be happening. I've tried getting rid of them, but nothing I tried worked. When I was 16, we lived next to this old abandoned 2-story house that had, at one time, been a boarding house or hotel. I had only ever seen one family move into that 2-story house, and all the time we lived next to it. They stayed there a few months but left rather suddenly. By the time of this event, the house had been abandoned for years. I had gone out to feed my dog, Rowdy, after dinner, and was starting to get dark. Now normally Rowdy came running up to me as all good boys do, but this night he was stood at the fence growling towards the 2-story house. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I spoke to Rowdy. He looked up at me and wagged his tail. Then he immediately positioned himself between me and the house next door and resumed his growling. I looked towards the house, not really noticing anything at first. Then I looked up towards one of the 2nd-story windows, and there looking back at me was this tall, thin figure staring at me. His face was pale and gaunt, and his eyes were sunk in and glimmered red. For a moment I thought they blinked. His hair was long, white, and straggly. This figure was dressed like someone straight out of the late 1800s. Think of how Kurt Russell was dressed in Tombstone, and that would be very close. Upon seeing this, I ran for it, vaulting over the fence and clambering into my home. I don't even remember opening the screen door. My dad took one look at me and I could see the concern on his face. I told him of what I had seen, leaving out the part about the blinking red eyes, as I wasn't sure if I had actually seen that or not, and he immediately picked up the phone and called the cops. It took a little while for the cops to show up, but when they did, they took my statement, and after saying it was probably just some kids or a vagrant, they walked towards the house next door. Sometime later they returned to tell us that there were signs that the house had been broken into, but that there were no signs of anyone being there recently. It was suggested that I, a 16-year-old, had just imagined it or that it was a reflection of a passing car. As far as the adults were concerned, all was well. It took a few days to muster up the courage, but when I did, I went to have a look for myself. I simply had to prove to myself that I wasn't seeing things or hoping that I was. The front door was locked, but the back door was still ajar, but only just. It took some doing, but I managed to force it open. The bottom of the door scraped along the floor as I did so. The floor was coated with a layer of dust and detritus, but I could make out footprints here and there where the cops had made their way through the house. The place smelled musty with a hint of mold and rat droppings. In the corner of one of the front rooms, it looked like someone had been squatting in the house. An old camping lantern, a sleeping bag, some discarded clothing, and some trash, but you could easily tell that these items hadn't been used recently. The rest of the house proved empty save a few pieces of old furniture, lots of cobwebs, and even more dust. Following the footsteps upstairs, I found the room corresponding to the window where I had seen the gaunt figure. Immediately, every hair on my body pricked and I got an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that I should not be there. My fight or flight was in overdrive but couldn't figure out which way to go. The door creaked as I pushed it open and that certainly didn't help my current state of mind. But I persevered. I grit my teeth and walked toward the window half expecting something to jump out at me, but nothing did. When I got to the window I stood there for a moment looking down into my backyard. I could see my dog tossing his food bowl around and chasing after it. Across the way, I could see cars going over the railroad tracks, and their brake lights lit up as they slowed down to cross the tracks. I thought to myself, maybe I did just see a reflection. The brake lights would certainly explain the red eyes I saw, but not the face. And certainly not the tall figure dressed like the late 1800s. I had almost convinced myself that none of it had been real and was about to turn to leave when I saw, just for the merest sliver of a split second, in broad daylight, an image of the man I had seen in the window. It was almost like I was looking in a mirror, except the face I saw wasn't my own. Had I blinked in that moment I would have missed it, but I hadn't blinked. In a jolt, my fight or flight made up its mind and I, as they say, vacated post-haste. This event triggered a series of serial nightmares, lasting several years. Not every night, mind you, but every month or so I'd have a nightmare picking up where the last one left off. And to this day I can still recall the image of that ghastly figure well enough to describe everything about him in perfect detail. Right down to the brownish paisley pattern of his vest.
When I was 7, my family moved into a one-story house in Los Angeles, California. My mom had always loved this house but was outbid when it had been on the market previously. Now, a few years later, it was for sale again and this time, my parents had the winning bid. My mom later told me that when they first bought it, the dining room had been painted black and she heard the previous owners had conducted seances there. My mom had grown up with her mother using the Ouija board and tarot cards, so knowing seances were conducted there didn't scare her off. We had many experiences in this house, but the one that sticks out to me the most is this. My sister and I shared a room, but she usually went to sleep in our parents' room almost every night because she got scared. One night, I was woken up by a tapping on my shoulder. When I awoke, I saw the silhouette of an adult man walking slowly across my room. It was like a shadow on the far wall and I still clearly remember his profile. He was tall, with a sharp pointy nose and a strong jawline. I froze. I watched as the man walked slowly and then disappeared. I was terrified and hid under my blankets. I guess that's what you do when you're only 7 years old. I remember pretending to be asleep, not sure if what I saw was a ghost or an intruder. The next morning, I told my parents and they were silent for a minute. That's when I knew I wasn't the only one experiencing things in that house. My father started experiencing severe night terrors, including one night when he thought he was physically fighting someone and he fell through their bedroom's glass window. We didn't live there long. However, when we moved, the paranormal experiences continued, as though it followed us. We had only moved a few blocks away to a rental house that we lived in for 1 year before my parents bought another house that was also just a couple blocks away. It makes me wonder if there is something in that entire vicinity. The experiences we had in those other 2 houses were just as strange as in the first house. We had a sudden rat infestation, our dog died for no reason, things went missing, we had ghost sightings, and if this all doesn't make me sound crazy enough, I also had experience with fairies. But my main ghost story is definitely when I was 7 and was awoken by a ghost man in the middle of the night. I will never forget it. I'd love to say it was my first and only ghost experience, but it was neither.
If you have any stories you'd like to be featured for future videos, be sure to email us at shadowbuddytv@gmail.com.